And to have it sound that full a cappella is very impressive, right? Speaks very much to his skill as an arranger, to be able to have each of these vocalists fill in the sonic space, especially just specifically where they need to be, in a way that gives us a phenomenal foundational structure, right? Now, before all of this happened, before Perkinson was working with Marvin Gaye and Sidney Poitier, before he worked with Donald Byrd and the Blackbirds and Harry Belafonte, before all of that fun stuff, he was involved in something very crucial. He was the co-founder of the Symphony of the New World. And this was the very first ever integrated orchestra in the United States. Now, this is not to say that there were no black orchestras or otherwise in the US. There were a few local black orchestras, but it was still segregated because, of course, this was 1965 that this was founded in. Take a second and think about where that was chronologically, right, in US history. We've got all of these major assassinations occurring of our great leaders. We still hadn't yet passed the Voting Rights Act. And really our community was still grieving very much. Very, very much. And these brilliant, audacious individuals, Coleridge-Taylor, Perkinson, Ben Steinberg, Dean Dixon, remember we talked about Maestro Dixon before, Elaine Jones, Joan Wilder, Wilmer Wise, these folks co-founded a phenomenal institution which was Symphony of the New World. It was co-sponsored by folks like Bernstein and Aaron Copland, Samuel Quaterburn, Langston Hughes, and Ruby Dee, who, if you were here for the last lecture, you'll recall, Ruby Dee was one of the starring actresses in the film we talked about in the last episode of St. Louis Blues. Anyways, she also, just remember, she also co-starred in the first film that Sidney Poitier ever directed before this. This is, I think, the second film that he directed. I think Montgomery to Memphis came next. Anyway, this was really a phenomenal occurrence. Nothing had ever happened like this before, not on this scale, certainly. And we were finally being able to see not just black classical instrumentalists feel that they have a place, but black composers, black conductors were finally feeling that they had a place where they could be respected and not just brought in feeling like something of a charity case, for lack of a better word. Now, this Symphony for the New World, it wasn't without its issues. Its main music director was a white man, Ben Steinberg. He considered himself to be a white radical, which was impressive given the time. But sometimes it's not enough, frankly, to be an ally when you yourself are not experiencing the pain of oppression. You don't necessarily know how to best help those that you claim to ally yourself with. Now, this is pulled directly from that New York Times article right here. And often when people have quoted this article, they have taken this quote from Mr. Ronald Lipscomb, who was a super prolific, really powerful cellist that was often soloing with the orchestra, and he was an integral part of this orchestra. And people often just take a snippet of this quote where he says that this should be seen for what it is, a middle-class operation with integrationist ideals having no relation whatsoever to the mass of black people. They often cut the first line of him saying, "We are happy to be here." They also often cut the line afterwards. Only a white man could have found the money and backing to make this orchestra work. But what we want now is a black orchestra, black owned, black operated, and black controlled. Understandable, right? And thankfully now we do have wonderful organizations like the Sphinx organization, we have the Rich Chamber Players, we have a lot more. We have all of these wonderful projects at the DSO trying to reach out to bring in, as well as many other orchestra programs trying to bring in more Black orchestral students. But Mr. Ronald Lipscomb, I think his point in particular at the time, first of all, he was a 24-year-old when he was quoted in this article. Already very established. But Mr. Lipscomb gives a very unique point of view on these events. And, sorry, this is the part where I get really excited. Because while Mr. Perkinson, of course, passed a couple decades ago, Ronald Lipscomb is still alive. There he is. He's 80 years old. He's still a cellist, a teacher, and he was kind enough to speak with me when I reached out to him. So first, to get into his history, he was a very, very remarkable cellist. He studied with the great Pablo Casals, who's one of the greatest cellists of all time. If you're familiar at all with the Bach suites, the Bach preludes, often you'll hear just this movement is what's played usually. Yeah, I know that one. Pablo Casals is credited for bringing those pieces back into the repertoire and rediscovering them, helping start with the Bach revival. People didn't play those pieces before Pablo Casals, and later on he passed on his wisdom and musicality to Ronald Lipscomb. And we're going to talk a little bit about that connection between Bach and some of Perkinson's pieces as we move on. But he performed with many, many phenomenal artists. He performed with the New York Philharmonic under the great Leonard Bernstein when he was there. He also performed with the American Symphony. He worked with all kinds of really powerful jazz and soul artists, including Gladys Knight, Isaac Hayes, Marvin Gaye, Sammy Davis Jr. He recorded on that James Brown Live at the Apollo album. He was also he was on many albums of McCoy Tyner's, as well as Alice Coltrane's. And he also worked with Milt Jackson, Wadud Ahmad. Really was a very important cellist to know at the time. He told me that it was nice for a while getting calls for studio works. He said Ron Carter would always call him if he needed to put on a cellist that wasn't him. You know. Anyways, a wonderful man, really wonderful. And he is the only reason that we have this piece right here. This is Coleridge-Taylor Perkinson's Lamentations. It is a Black folk song suite for solo cello. It was written, was commissioned in 73. And it was written for Lipscomb at his request because he told me, he says, I had an upcoming concert, so, I called him up. I said, can you write something for me? Clearly he did. And it became this wonderful, wonderful piece. And of course, Perkinson later said that the common denominator of these tunes is the reflection and statement of a people's crying out. And I would speculate that Perkinson had an affinity for strings, because out of the 22 non-commissioned or non-commercial pieces that he composed, 12 of them were for various string configurations, including, of course, the orchestral works, but many of them were for string quartet or for trio. There is a piece for piano and viola. There are a couple of really beautiful pieces, but I have to admit this one's my favorite, and not just because it's for solo cello. Let's get into it. I'm going to talk about the first movement first. I think it's only fair, right? Now, I've got the sheet music here with me. But I'm not going to be reading off of it, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it around if you guys would like to look at it. Now, this first movement is entitled Fuguing Tune, and there are several arguments about where this name comes from. All right, we all, as you recall, I mentioned Bach earlier. Bach was famous, of course, for his fugues. And in a fugue, you have an initial statement, which then goes on to be developed, and you hear it restated by each individual voice as they enter. So at first you'll have, for example, if the opening statement was this. Then each time you got to the end of the phrase, that particular voice that just made that opening statement would change on to take on a different role. They would become the counter melody or some kind of harmony to the next voice that enters and brings in that statement once again. And so it becomes this kind of Tetrising pattern until all of the voices are in and they start playing around more with that statement. Now there's also a fuguing tune, which is a bit more direct in touch with this name. And that was something that was the choral fugues took root in New England in the late 1700s, but this fuguing tune is kind of similar to a style called sacred harp singing, which is very common in the Deep South, especially in Alabama. And it was an a cappella form of singing where folks would come in very similar to the fugue, where they would come in with these statements and these harmonies, but it was a little bit less strict in terms of the order of which you could do things. You could have folks come in all at once on the statement and then go back out, which you'll see actually in this piece. So I'm going to play it for you, and I want you to really listen for that opening statement. I'm going to play it for you really quick. I'll play the very opening. That's our opening statement. Thank you. So that's our first movement. It's very rich, isn't it? Has a lot of heft to it. Now, this movement, as well as all the others, uses several specific tools that Perkinson uses to get his point across. One of them is polyphony. Polyphony just means we're having multiple voices at once that are all doing very different things. So when you heard me play, perhaps you heard at the beginning, especially, you hear this first line. All of a sudden we've got two lines. All right, and we add more lines throughout. And that was after our initial statement that we had, right? That. Very emphatic, very powerful, but also a bit sad. Distressed, perhaps, is a more accurate word. I would argue there's a good bit of rage in this piece as well as grief. All things that I think are very foundational aspects of the Black experience. Now, this polyphony did not, of course, didn't come out of a vacuum, but it also didn't come from Europe, no matter what certain institutions might try to tell you. No, see, this kind of polyphony and these specific harmonies that were being used here are actually coming from plantation harmony, what was later renamed barbershop harmony. Right? Now, I wasn't at the barbershop, but I did my research, and I learned that these richnesses of harmonies that were later documented as barbershop harmony, the tritones that you'll often hear, they tend to denote stress. Now, you'll also hear them perhaps in just a dominant chord that's telling us we're going somewhere else. Resolve it, it's fine. So these, that flat seventh, that tritone, those sounds are very distinctly plantation harmony. And these were the harmonies that were often sung with the Negro spirituals that were unfortunately only documented often as one line, because often the people that were documenting them, first of all, were not the creators of this music. They were not Black folks. They were often white people that were documenting these things, that were doing it either for anthropological reasons, or in the case of the composer Delius, to steal and repurpose. But frankly, they did not believe that these harmonies were worth documenting, because they were often improvised, and because of the rawness of them, they couldn't understand, and they thought, oh, well, surely it's just because they're amateurs. No, our ancestors were quite brilliant with this. Yeah. And Perkinson knew that, and he put it into his compositions. Now, let's take a look at the next movement, the song form. It's called this because of the structure of it. It's got an AABA format, where you have the first two A's are these two repetitions, and then we have the B section where it stretches and develops some of these themes into something a little bit different, and then we come back at the end back to our A, back to our initial phrasing. And this piece utilizes the tritone a lot more, but in a very distinct way. This piece, it uses the tritone often at the end of a phrase. And it's quite strange, but it's done in such a way that by the time you get to the end of the piece, what at first might have felt like tension, that tritone sound, feels like a release, like a resolution. And that is not only a testament to Perkinson's compositional skills, but also to how they relate, I believe, to the Black experience. Now, this particular movement doesn't have a whole lot of literature about where Perkinson's inspiration came from with it. But when I first learned this piece, I really initially thought of the bittersweetness of taking a break, of a breath, of being able to know, okay, in this moment, I may breathe, I may rest, I'm safe, I'm okay. But knowing I might not be in the next one. Knowing that right now, it's all right, but there may be more to come. There is most likely more bad things to come. And the descriptions of the song and the composition, he just says plaintive. That's all he tells us. This is my interpretation of that. And listen out for how that tritone seems to change function. Thank you.